Thank you, Minister Ryan, and I'd like to thank the Minister for setting out so clearly the challenge we face, but also the opportunities we have to create a better society and economy through addressing climate change. I'd now like to ask the technical crew to cue Deborah Roberts, who's our keynote speaker. Deborah is going to be talking on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability of climate change. Now, I've just received a note to say that Deborah is under severe climate conditions and her house is flooded, so she's had to make special arrangements to talk to us live this morning. She'll deliver her talk to us verbally, showing slides, but we do hope to be able to see her for a few questions from the floor afterwards. So in what must be stressful enough conditions for her, I want to thank her for joining us this morning. So ladies and gentlemen, if you'd welcome Professor Deborah Roberts, co-chair of Working Party 2 of the IPCC. And I just want to check, Deborah, if you can hear us.
3, 2, 1, go.
I can indeed. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you. Over to you.
Great. Just the technical people I can hear myself. So it's very hard to talk. If we could stop that echo, it would be great. Excellent. Super. Now I can only hear myself. And although you can't see me, I can assure you I'm here and we will work to switch on the camera at the end of the presentation. Firstly, thank you to Minister Ryan for those incredibly powerful and compelling words. I was cheering silently on this side. And thank you for the EPA for offering me this opportunity to talk to you about the outcomes of the Working Group 2 report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was released what seems like a lifetime ago now at the end of February this year. And Working Group 2 deals with the impacts, adaptation and vulnerability to climate change. And anyone who knows anything about the IPCC reports knows that they are monumental reports to produce. This one took 5 years. It took 270 authors from 67 countries. And during the course of preparing the report, they assessed over 34,000 papers, had to respond individually to over 62,000 comments from government and expert reviewers. And ultimately, we produced a report which is over 3,000 pages in length. Gratefully, I'm not going to ask you to read all 3,000 pages, but what I really hope to do is to bring you some of the key messages of that report and hope that they will inform your discussions. The first message is the one you see on the screen. We can no longer argue with the science. The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being. It's a threat to the health of the planet that we are so dependent on. And any further delay we have as a global society in coming together to act together, as the Minister indicated, is going to miss this very brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity. We have to secure a livable future for us all, not only this generation, but indeed generations still to come. So what does the report tell us about where we are now? Well, it's really clear that global warming has already caused dangerous and widespread disruption in nature. And that's linked to the increase in the frequency and the intensity and the duration of extreme events, both on land, but also in the ocean, which are currently driving mass mortalities. And on this slide, you see tree dieback in a drought-stressed forest in California. But importantly, too, climate change is currently affecting the lives of billions of people around the world, despite their efforts to adapt. And this is because of the impacts linked to the human intensification of tropical cyclones, the increase in sea level rise, the increase in heavy precipitation events. And as Brian indicated, I'm now living in a part of South Africa which has been declared to be under a state of emergency and disaster because of the very extreme precipitation we had in April last year, or April this year. And those kinds of impacts are driving increased losses and damages around the world. The report also indicates that impacts are magnified in the world's cities, and that's really important because we're an urban species now. More than half of the world's population lives in cities. And we know from the assessment our authors did that the increase in heat waves continues to exacerbate the urban heat island, exacerbates urban air pollution, all of which have public health consequences. And many of us know from personal experience the impact that extreme events can have on urban infrastructure. So water and sanitation. There's some communities in my city currently who haven't had water for 50 days since the heavy precipitation event. The impact on transport, the impact on energy systems. But the report also tells us that we live in a very different world. We're no longer dealing with singular extreme events. We're now in a situation where we have to contend with multiple extreme events, which create compound risks that are extremely difficult for us to manage. So think of heat and drought coming together. That not only reduces crop yields, but reduces productivity of farm workers. That results in reduced household income, drives an increase in food prices, both at the local level, but also potentially globally. So a really critical message that climate risk doesn't respect any national boundary. And these extreme events related to weather changes are and will continue to shock global trade. But the report is also a reality check. It asks us not to be myopic. The world does not conduct its business around the issue of climate change. We, in fact, have a much broader basket of challenges to deal with than just climate change itself. And so climate change combines with these other challenges. So unsustainable use of natural resources, habitat destruction, growing urbanization and inequity. And all of these things together with climate change serve to undermine our adaptive capacity and the adaptive capacity of the natural systems we depend on. When I talk to audiences, and particularly when I talk about vulnerable communities, I often think that people think that the vulnerable communities are in the minority and they exist somewhere in a far-flung place on the globe. But again, this is a myth that our report really busts wide open. We show through our assessment that we currently have an enormous number of people, 3.3 to 3.6 billion people, living in hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. And no surprise here, the assessment shows us that the bulk of these people live in Africa, they live in South Asia, South and Central America, the small island states, and the polar regions. And again, these communities are not only dealing with climate change. Their lives would be so much simpler if climate change was the only thing they were dealing with. They're dealing with a whole host of overlapping challenges. Lack of access to basic services. Many of these communities have climate-sensitive livelihoods, so small-scale fishers, small-scale farmers. They often also have to contend with high levels of poverty, weak leadership, lack of funding, lack of accountability and trust in government. So that's what the report tells us about where we are. What does it tell us about where we're going? Here it really underscores a really important message that the IPCC has been highlighting since our special report on 1.5 degrees of global warming. And that is every small increase in warming will result in increased risks to nature and people. And here we see bleached coral in a dying coral reef off the coast of Okinawa in Japan. These slides show us the impact on natural systems, the kind of biodiversity loss that we might experience at different global warming levels. And you can see a very stark difference between a world in which we're successful in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees and a world in which global warming levels reach 3 degrees. And important to note, our assessment also tells us that even if we only exceed a global warming level of 1.5 for several decades, we can still expect irreversible losses. And these will involve species extinction, the losses of entire ecosystems such as mountaintops, tropical coral reefs, and coastal wetlands. And as we move from a world where we limit global warming to 1.5 to a world of potentially 3 degrees of global warming, the risk of extinction in biodiversity hotspots increases by about 10-fold. And the question many politicians would then most likely ask me is, but why are we concerned about biodiversity loss if we've got all of these other challenges? And here the report is really clear. It underscores the deep and integrated relationship between the natural world and human society and the climate system, and really underpins the understanding that we are heavily dependent on nature for critical ecosystem services. And if we impact on nature and impact on those ecosystem services, we put at risk things like pollination, which then puts us at risk of food security. We potentially undermine important economic sectors such as tourism and recreation. And we put at risk very basic services such as access to clean air and clean water. And of course, the greatest impact is for those communities that are directly dependent on nature for basic services. So indigenous communities, local communities, people living in informal settlements. The report also paints us a picture of the future landscape we might expect from a global risk point of view. Certainly continued exposure to heat waves, the sort that we're currently seeing in India and Pakistan, is going to continually and increasingly affect crops, ecosystems, and people. From a water scarcity point of view, at 2 degrees Celsius, those regions relying on snowmelt are going to experience this very significant decline in water availability, which will impact on agricultural production after 2050. And we all know that climate change undermines food security. The fact that India has stopped wheat exports because of extremely high temperatures indicates that. And by the time we reach 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, South and Central America, and the small island states will be experiencing food shortages that will drive mass malnutrition. By the middle of the century, we'll have about 1 billion people living in low-lying cities by the sea and on small islands, and they're going to be at risk from sea level rise. So that's where we are and where we're going to be going. What does the report tell us about how we've responded to these challenges? Well, the good news is it indicates that action on adaptation has increased, and that's encouraging. The worst news, though, is that progress is uneven and we're simply not adapting fast enough. And this is even in a situation where we've got 170 countries and indeed many cities around the world that have already incorporated adaptation into their plans and policies. The message from the report is extremely clear. There are increasing gaps between what we're doing and what we need to do. The gaps are largest for low-income populations, which means that drives inequity, and inequity anywhere in the world undermines the adaptive capacity of us all. And if we continue doing what we're doing, these gaps are simply going to continue to grow. The good news is, and the Minister highlighted this, is that there are available, feasible, effective options we can take to reduce the risk to people and nature, but their effectiveness decreases with increased warming. And generally, when we think about adaptation, we think about reducing the impacts of floods, securing water supplies. But our report really points out that there's a great deal to be gained from, for example, strengthening health systems, because that allows you to deal with the trauma of extreme events, with the impacts of heat stress, with the spread of disease. And we can further increase our adaptive capacity by enhancing disease surveillance, by putting in place early warning systems, and providing very basic services such as potable water. The report also calls out that nature offers us a significant and untapped potential. I was really encouraged by the Minister's words in this regard. Nature allows us to deal not only with the causes of climate change, but to reduce the risks from climate change, but also to support our lives and livelihoods. So, for example, agroforestry is a great climate resilient way to produce food, but to create wildlife habitat at the same time. And here we see a Nigerian rubber farmer not only growing rubber trees, but fruit trees, food crops, and also diversifying his livelihood by keeping bees. The report outlines for us a range of adaptation options from different sectors. Water is where we are affecting most of our adaptation options. From an agricultural point of view, we know irrigation has been used for thousands of years as a tool for adaptation, but the report cautions that it could have a negative impact, for example, depleting groundwater supplies. But well planned, well executed, together with things like rainwater storage, water-saving technologies, moisture conservation in soils, all of these approaches could have economic and ecological benefits and reduce vulnerabilities not only of human communities, but natural communities as well. The wider options that are available to us include securing drinking water for our urban areas, working with nature, so restoring those wetlands, restoring floodplains, land use planning, for example, the use of no-build zones, Flood and drought risk management. This is where the majority of our adaptation is currently happening. But we need to bear in mind that the effectiveness of all of these water-linked options declines with increasing warming. In the agricultural sector, from the perspective of food security, here effective options called out include using stress-tolerant crops and livestock, agroforestry, farm diversification, community-based adaptation, particularly where we draw on indigenous and local knowledge and where that's well resourced, strengthening biodiversity, that'll help us with pollination and crop pest control. These sorts of approaches have wider benefits for us. Improve food security and nutrition, health and well-being, and improve livelihoods. As someone who's a local government official in her day job, I'm particularly encouraged that the report shone a big spotlight on the world's cities. It calls out our cities as a global scale but time-limited opportunity to advance climate resilient development. And again, important, because by the middle of the century, 2/3 of us could be living in the world's cities. The adaptation options called out here look at combining nature-based and engineering approaches together. So, for example, gabion mattresses along a river together with restored floodplains. Establishing blue and green spaces in our cities, the use of urban agriculture to enhance food security. Social safety nets for disaster management to allow people to deal with the impacts of climate change, but also to improve financial security, particularly for the poor and disadvantaged. And the wider benefits that come from these approaches include public health improvements and ecosystem conservation. Again, another underlining in the report is around the need for adaptation in informal settlements. An important consideration, UN Habitat tell us that up to 1/3 of us could be living in informal settlements by the middle of the century. And the report underscores the fact that we can achieve city-scale impacts from an adaptation point of view if we use local knowledge, we have adequate skills, funding, and tools. And importantly, if we see policymakers sitting around the table taking decisions together with residents. And of course, government can further enhance effectiveness by improving accountability, commitment, and transparency. And here we see, for example, improvements in water and wastewater management in informal settlements in India. But the report, again, is a reality check. It says, don't think you're going to be able to adapt your way out of this problem. That horse has long bolted. And there are two particular concerns that the report underscores. Firstly, maladaptation. So adaptation that results in unintended consequences, such as an increase in greenhouse gas emissions or increases in inequity. And in these two images, you see, for example, coastal defenses that may or may not protect the people living and working behind them and could well result in further erosion down the coast, compared to a much more nature-based approach to flood risk management being used in the US. And the report underscores that, unfortunately, it's the most disadvantaged groups again. So our indigenous communities, our local communities, our informal communities who are most affected by maladaptation, and this drives inequity. The second major point that the report makes is that there are real limits to adaptation. Even with the most effective adaptation we can put in place, we are no longer able to prevent all losses and damages. Certainly above 1.5 degrees, some natural solutions may no longer work because the ecosystems they rely on are so heavily impacted. And above 1.5, there may be certain communities who can no longer adapt because they depend on glaciers and snowmelt. By 2 degrees, it's going to be challenging to farm multiple staple crops in many current growing areas, particularly the tropical areas, which are so vulnerable to climate change. From a financial point of view, no surprise here. The report indicates that the current financial flows are insufficient, particularly into developing countries. The majority of the funding is going to mitigation. And the climate impacts that I've spoken about will slow down economic growth, are slowing down economic growth, and reducing the availability of resources for adaptation. So the message is clear. To avoid these mounting losses, we must increase the profile of adaptation on the political agenda. We have to do more about adaptation. But at the same time, we've got to keep our eye on that mitigation ball. We can't drop that ball. We've still got to make rapid, deep cuts in emissions to keep the maximum number of adaptation options open. And as Laura indicated, this is going to be tough. Our sister working group 3, has pointed to the fact in the last decade they assessed the average annual greenhouse gas emissions are at the highest levels in human history. We are not on track to limiting global warming to 1.5. Our emissions in 2019 were 54% higher than they were in 1990. So how do we accelerate and sustain adaptation? Well, a very clear message that we've been putting out into the world since the Special Report 1.5. Political commitment at all levels of government is clear. And that's why I think Minister Ryan's input today was just so powerful. We need that kind of political commitment to be global. We need clear institutional frameworks and national governments that are setting out the policy, providing clear directives for local government, but also providing local government with the funding to act on those policies. Enhancing knowledge of impacts and risks improves responses, both in society and in the political environment. And here, our arts community and our educational community can be very helpful. We must monitor and evaluate our adaptation measures. Because of the changing world we live in, what is good adaptation today may not be good adaptation 5 years or 20 years from now. We must have inclusive governance that prioritizes equity and justice. We must see civil society, the private sector, the public sector, all sitting around the table together. And the importance of adequate financing can't be stressed enough. To sustain and accelerate that adaptation, the report also calls out 5 key system transitions. So transitions in our natural system, our built systems, our energy system, industrial system, and our societal system. And these transitions make possible the kind of adaptation required for human health and well-being, economic and social resilience, and the health and well-being of the planet we're so dependent on. But they're also important for achieving those low global warming levels that keep adaptation options open. And if we adopt this much more systemic approach to adaptation, there are wider benefits for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So basic infrastructure to improve the climate resilience of rural communities helps us reduce poverty. Green buildings and green spaces in our cities helps us with good health and well-being. Increasing the access of youth to land helps us with reduced inequality. And by restoring connecting habitats, we help protect life on land and below water. So what does Working Group 2 tell us about our future? Well, it indicates we've got a choice. There's a spectrum of futures ahead of us. High resilience, low risk, and low resilience and high risk. And where we end up on that spectrum is entirely up to us, as Minister Ryan indicated. The extent to which we're ambitious about reducing risk through adaptation, the extent to which we put in place ambitious mitigation, the extent to which we invest our resources in key system transitions like enhancing biodiversity and ensuring our cities and settlements are sustainable, all with a view to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's this really integrated approach that the report refers to as climate resilient development. But we can only operationalize climate resilient development if it's considered across all levels of government and civil society. It involves everyone in forming partnerships. If we draw on wide-ranging knowledge, so scientific is important, that's why we've got the IPCC, but indigenous, local, and practical knowledge, equally important. We also have to be better stewards of the planet we rely on, and our report calls out the importance of effective and equitable conservation of 30 to 50% of the natural systems around the globe. It's also important that climate resilient development draws marginalized groups to the table. So women, youth, indigenous people, informal settlers who are not part of usual decision-making processes in many parts of the world. Prioritizing equity and justice in the decisions we make and how we invest, and helping reconcile different interests, values, and worldviews. But this is going to require scaled-up investment and international cooperation. Of that, there is no doubt. And so we find ourselves in a situation where our passport card has not given us a smiley face. Our past development has not advanced global climate resilient development, which is why that sense of urgency the Minister underscored is so important. Starting today, it's critical that every decision we each make, every action we take, takes us towards climate resilient development and not away from it. But again, reality check. This is going to be a tough ask. As the Minister pointed out, it's tough, but it gets us a better world. Achieving climate resilient development is already challenging at 1.1 degrees, but the prospects become further limited if warming exceeds 1.5 and simply may not be possible for many if warming exceeds 2 degrees. And so I end where I started. We can't argue with the science. It's really important that we come together as a global community to keep that window of opportunity open, not only for us, but for future generations. And hopefully this report will provide some encouragement to the discussions that you will have today. So with that, I'm going to hopefully start my video, and now you'll see that there's a real person behind the presentation.
Firstly, thanks very much, Deborah, for a very sobering and informative presentation on the multiple and interrelated challenges we face, the opportunities we have to adapt to
Brian,
climate change.
I can't hear you.
Okay. I will look to the technical guys. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I was thanking you for the very informative and sobering presentation you made around the multiple and interrelated challenges we're facing in climate, but also the opportunities we have to adapt while being mindful of the risks of maladaptation, as you put it, and also being aware that we can't adapt our way out of the impact of climate change now. We've gone beyond that point, and also that the most vulnerable segments of the world's population are being the most affected. So thank you for that. We'll look to take some questions from the floor or online. If people want to ask a question to Professor Roberts, if you could raise your hand, and we may have time for 5 or 6 questions, if that's okay with you, Deborah.
That's perfect, thank you.
Thanks. I see a raised hand.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Deborah. This is Frank McGovern here. Thanks for the great presentation. And obviously, the IPCC takes a global perspective, and you articulated a lot of the challenges. But I wonder, how would you prioritise what needs to be done? And also, do you have a view on how a shared goal, a shared global goal in adaptation could be stated? Thank you.
Brian, are you going to be taking group?
I might take a couple more, if there are a couple more, and then let you respond. Any further raised hands? I see another hand here.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. Just on the sustainable finance aspect, you said that there was targets in place to track mitigation rather than adaptation. And do you see that changing over the course of the next few years at all? Thank you.
And then we might take one more from the audience, and if there's one online as well. So we might take 2 more and then hand over to you.
So this is one of the online questions from an anonymous questioner, and it's saying that it's clear that insufficient mobilisation of finance is a key issue to implement.
Sorry, I'm unable to hear the audio.
Oh, is that any better? Is that good?
Yeah, that's slightly better.
Brilliant. So this is an anonymous question online, and it's saying that it's clear that insufficient mobilisation of finance is a key issue to implementing adaptation strategies, further damaging relations between the global north and the global south. And how do you feel that we can reconcile this?
Thanks for that. And we've one more from the floor.
Hi, my name is Patrick Gaynor. Thanks very much for the talk. I'd just like to ask your thoughts on how we can improve engagement at a local level. There was talking earlier on about how, say, in the Irish mind, there's a willingness to address climate change. But on a local level, when it comes down to maybe addressing flooding, moving towards pedestrianisation, or any of the various changes that we're faced with, I think it's quite fair to say that there isn't consensus. And rather than kind of, I guess, pretending there is, I think it's important that we find ways to deliberate on the lack of consensus, and I guess it ties into issues of procedural justice. I think on a local level there's a real sense of not being heard and not having a fair say, and how we get past those issues I think is really important. So if you've any thoughts on that, I'd really love to hear your thoughts.
I might hand over to you now, Deborah, on those questions, if you want to take them in whatever order.
Great, thank you. And if I could ask my friends in the technical room, I've got the echo then. So I'm not certain what you switch. Right, let's try that. No, I've still got the echo. Just trying again. Oh, now the echo's getting more distant. Hopefully that won't distract me too much. So Frank, good to see you in the front row. Where would we prioritize action? Sorry, this echoes very disruptive. Is there anything we can do to switch it off?
I don't know if other people's mics are switched off. Would that help?
I think that might be the case. I'll try again. Yeah, I'll try and talk my way through it, but it's very disturbing to hear my voice coming back at me. So Frank, where would we prioritize action given the range of challenges that we have ahead? I think the challenge with adaptation, obviously, is it doesn't come with a global recipe like mitigation does. So there isn't one silver bullet. What I have indicated is the report has two particular points of focus. Thank you. Someone switched off something, which is great. So, which I think are great places to start. We spoke about the 5 system transitions, but the report really highlights 2 of those system transitions as places we can prioritize action now. One of those is obviously the work around biodiversity and dealing with the huge impact we've had as a society on that. And I think that's important. And I heard that coming out very loudly and clearly from Minister Ryan's speech. The other one, the world cities. I think they provide us with enormous opportunities, certainly in terms of the global south, where we don't have the lock-in, but we have high risk, where we can have that integrated climate resilient development. So certainly the priorities to me that leap out from that report really are around actions around biodiversity and urban areas. I think those are great opportunities. In terms of the global goal and adaptation, that's going to be a tough one because I think because adaptation is so context specific, it's not going to be a clean cut commitment either to a percentage reduction in greenhouse gases as you have in mitigation or a temperature goal. But I think it might be something linked to these key sectors. So potentially a global goal and adaptation, which is linked to commitments in for example, the 5 key system transitions. Yeah, but there'll be a lot of discussions that I think that need to be had around that. In terms of finance, I had 2 questions around that. Are we likely to see a change in those financial flows? So the current flows into mitigation with a far lower percentage into adaptation, and would such changes help reconcile the difference that exists between the global north and global south? I think we are going to, our hand is already forced. I mean, if we look at the kind of challenges we've had in this year alone, for example, the current heat waves in India, I look at the huge level of destruction that's happened in my own city, an important port city. We, through our port, feed the economy of the Southern African development region. We can't move things through our port. I think those impacts, those extreme events are going to necessitate an increase in adaptation simply out of pure survival. I don't think it can be avoided anymore. The level of impacts are so extreme that I think we are going to have to respond at that level. So I'm really hoping that the COP at Sharm el-Sheikh at the end of this year, I know that the Egyptian presidency has got a strong focus on issues of adaptation and losses and damages. I'm hoping that the kind of ambition we saw going into Glasgow around mitigation and the desire to see movement there will also be repeated around adaptation at Sharm el-Sheikh. So I think reality will drive that change. And how do we improve engagement at the local level? And I really do agree with that speaker. It's entirely one thing to talk about climate change at the global level. It's quite entirely something different to try and encourage local action. The way we've done it, and certainly it's a message that comes through very strongly in our report, is getting people around the table. We've pointed that out in relation to informal settlements, in terms of climate resilient development generally, is that we need the stakeholders to be drawn to the table. That means government must make these processes more accessible to others, so that people who are previously not part of the conversation can be part of the conversation, can indicate their priorities, can contribute their agency to the change. And certainly through our very practical experience here in Durban, ensuring that our climate responses address people's developmental priorities has been a sure way of drawing people to the table. For many, those basic needs, developmental challenges are critical and need to be on the table. So we need to move away from a world where we see development as separate from our climate change responses, these more integrated responses that see development drawn into it and community priorities being reflected, I think is critical. Thanks.
Look, thank you very much, Deborah, and thanks for joining us this morning in what
Brian,
I know...
I think they need to switch your mic back on now.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? No. If my mic could come back on. I don't know, Deborah, can you hear me?
The challenge of hybrid events.
Yeah, okay. Look, I know you can't hear me. I'm just ask the audience to show their appreciation.
Unable to hear you, Brian.
Yeah.